Knowing what's right doesn't mean much unless you do what's right. And with these words from Theodore Roosevelt, welcome to Live Oak Unitarian Universalist Congregation. I'm Kendra Wise, I'm a member of the worship ministry, and I am your worship associate this morning. This morning, it is my pleasure to introduce Peter Haslund as our speaker. Peter, thank you for the time, attention, and care that you've put into preparing today's sermon. I'm grateful that you're sharing that part of your story with us today. So now is our time for meditation. You can settle into your chair, into your body, in a comfortable position. Take a few breaths. Lower your gaze or close your eyes if you wish, and listen to these words from Anne Frank, the Dutch Jewish girl who with her family hid in an attic in Amsterdam during the Nazi occupation of the Netherlands. Anne's words survived the Holocaust, although she herself did not. She wrote, "I can feel the suffering of millions, and yet, if I look up into the heavens, I think that it will all come right, that this cruelty too will end, and that peace and tranquility will return again. In the meantime, I must uphold my ideals, for perhaps the time will come when I shall be able to carry them out."
I'm here today to tell a story. In a way, it's a war story, but it's really far more. It has to do with our human reaction to each other, to adversity, to the source of that courage that comes to us when most needed to do the right thing. I'm going to do this in 3 parts. Okay, so I'm a retired professor. I do things in 3 parts. The first part is a contextual thing. I'm going to sort of give you some history and historical setting so that the rest of it will make some kind of sense. Because large numbers of Americans that I've encountered have had very little understanding of things like the occupation of Denmark during the Second World War. The second part is my part in that story. That's a very personal thing. And in a sense, that's really unlike much of whatever else I may have said from this pulpit. And finally, what I call the so what part of any sermon. Yes, you told an interesting story, but so what? What does it matter? What do we take away? How is it important? So we begin with a slide of a newspaper headline that depicts the invasion of Denmark. It should be said that Denmark had declared its neutrality, and usually a statement of neutrality is accepted as, okay, we're not going to invade you. You're going to stay out of this fight. But unlike World War I, when the neutrality was accepted, World War II, it was not accepted, and Germany invaded Denmark on April 9th, 1940, which is about 6 months after I was born. This is said just to assure you that I had nothing to do with it. Now, the German force entering Denmark included about 120,000 ground troops, as well as an air assault of 527 aircraft. That's a huge force when considering that the entire Danish military establishment was constituted by 14,000 men-at-arms. 120,000 to 14,000. The invasion ended within 6 hours. Because the case was hopeless, the Danish government sued for peace. The German objective in Denmark was to create a model occupied state that would cooperate with and export to Germany. Danish agriculture was very important to its strategic objectives. So it was important to keep the Danes relatively happy. And so they did that, in part with a surrender package that allowed Denmark to retain its own government. There were guarantees given that Danish citizens would not be challenged. They would go about their lives just as they ordinarily did. And that the hinted German final solution would not be applied to Denmark. The final solution had to do with the Jews. The Danish king would continue to be allowed to do his thing. It wasn't that he asked for permission, he simply took it. And he continued to ride his horse around Denmark. There is an apocryphal story that my mother told me that one time the king stopped and took me up on his horse. I don't know if it's true. But she continued by saying, after a while she got really nervous about it. This guy in a uniform on a horse took her kid down the street. And that was ended rather abruptly. So I guess the point of this section is to give you the impression that there was a deal made between the Germans and the Danes, the function of which was to keep Denmark running as normal as possible so that Danish agricultural products would continue to supply the German army. This deal lasted from April 1940 to October 1941. What happened? The resistance happened. Danish resistance grew during the first years of the occupation. I think this stands as testimony to an axiom of nationalism. People can tolerate an occupying force only so long before resisting. So a small number of Danish patriots did terrible things to railroad trains that were going south to Germany. They picked up huge sections of railroad track and deposited these tracks somewhere far away so they couldn't be easily replaced. This annoyed Hitler in no small amount, and he called a conference for June of 1943, declaring that something had to be done. The something that had to be done was to round up the Jews and to execute a bunch of resistance fighters. And this was to take place in October of 1943. He had recalled the German plenipotentiary, that's a guy who was in charge of Denmark. His name was Werner Best, and he went to this conference and was given his new orders. And this was to round up about 8,000 Danish Jews. Well, Best was in a quandary, as he was now working with two sets of orders that contradicted each other. The one said, make nice with the Danes so that we don't mess with agriculture. And the other was round up the Jews, which was contrary to what had been agreed to originally. And so, I mean, Hitler was the sort of leader who you didn't ask for clarification. You're supposed to understand what the leader said because he was always right. You know, infallibility is the word of the hour. So you're to figure it out by yourself. You couldn't stop, because that was to contradict the leader. You couldn't do that. So what to do? Well, he decided to do both, but to do one of them badly. He decided to impose conditions by which the German forces could round up the Jews. You were to knock on the door, and if nobody answered, you don't break it in. you were to look the other way. And someone within his entourage leaked the information that in the 1st of October, the German forces would begin rounding up the Jews. The leak included the head rabbi of Copenhagen. His name was Marcus Melchior. And he warned his congregation about the impending danger, scheduled to begin October 1st, which was also the beginning of Rosh Hashanah. Within 24 hours, everybody in Denmark knew what was going to be happening. There were many boats going to Sweden in the beginning of October, and my mother was on one of them. A short distance between the Danish coast and Sweden, by mid-October, about 7,500 Jews, or 95%, were in Sweden. So here's part 2. I was born in October of '39. My mother had not really planned on becoming a mom, and she was very busy making costumes for the theater. Problem created by being both mom and engaged in a career was solved by hiring someone to come into our home and act as a governess for me and as an assistant seamstress for my mother. Her name was Else Mikkelsen, who had just come from a farm community near the small city of Slagelse. Here she is. From time to time, I would travel back with her to her parents' farm to be acclimated to farm life, which my mother thought was a pretty good thing. Apparently, the exodus happened very quickly. My mom was given a couple of hours' notice before the boat sailed for Sweden, and shortly thereafter, I was off to Slagelse. When I arrived with Else, I was told that my mother would not be coming to fetch me, that I would not be returning to Copenhagen. I don't know whether they said it was a final done deal. I don't remember that, but I can imagine that a 4-year-old would interpret anything like that as being a final thing. I remember with painful clarity that my mother would not be coming back at all, and I can remember standing by the hedge that marked the entrance of our farm and crying uncontrollably. Efforts to calm me down were of no avail. My mother was simply not coming back in my mind. That event is as clear to me this minute as it was then. What I learned later was that an elaborate story had been concocted to explain my existence on the farm. Else had gone away to the big city and magically gotten pregnant, and she had returned to her parents' farm to raise her little boy. That included whatever identity papers one needed at that time. They managed to create whatever documentation was necessary, and I became a little farmer. Life was good on the farm. I adored Else's dad, his name Adolf Mikkelsen. I followed him everywhere. He always wore these hand-carved shoes, wooden shoes, called træsko in Danish. Well, I had to have shoes just like his. And so someone carved little shoes, and you can see them on this picture, if you look very closely, little pointy toes, wooden shoes. Days were generally filled with adventures. Morning chores, mostly feeding the chickens, were followed by the pursuit of great adventures. I tried my hand at milking cows. A 4-year-old's hands are just not that big. I would scamper off to explore the reaches of the farm. Well, it was a small farm, and I would always be accompanied by my dog, with whom I shared whatever snacks I had been given to sustain life that day. My favorite was a section of blood sausage, or blodpølse. It's just wonderful stuff. And we never came back with any leftovers. Horses, we had animals on the farm, and they were all mine, you see. There were 2 horses, and they were mine. I think there were 4 milk cows. Fresh milk would be collected daily and sent off for processing. I can't remember the number of pigs, but we had lots of chickens. This is where I learned that a chicken dinner did not originate in the supermarket. Not that we had a supermarket. Harvest time was for everyone, and that was my time to help out, as everybody else did. When German soldiers would arrive, and this was not very often, sometimes we just suspected they were going to be there. When they did, Elsa's father would calmly suggest that I disappear for a while and go up into the hayloft. A cozy place had been prepared for me up there. There was a small piece of carpet, some toys, an old Victrola or record player with one of those wind-up things, and no records, of course, that might make noise. My instructions were to remain up in the hayloft until I could come down. I was admonished to remain very quiet. In a way, it was a game for me. I knew about the soldiers. I did not understand why they were there. I still don't. But I did understand that it would not be safe for me to come down or make any noise, so I didn't. Years later, my wife Bets told me to make some noise when I entered the room. She said I was just too quiet. I wonder where that came from. My mother lived in Sweden between 1943 and 46, while I was on the farm in Stälse. She would, of course, write to me and to Else, but never sign the letters with love, Mom. It was always from Aunt Eva, as she knew her letters would be censored. Here's a sample of such a letter. The watermark across the face of the letter indicates that it passed censorship. I didn't write much, but I shared copies of my artistic endeavors. During my time on the farm, I got very sick. It was either bad bronchitis or tuberculosis, but my farm family was very concerned that I might die during their time of taking care of me. This was in the dead of winter, and snowdrifts were huge. I remember them coming up against the house, and the roof and the snow would come together. It was decided that I really needed medical help, so Mr. Mikkelsen hitched up the horses to the wagon to take me to the doctor, whose office was in the village. I was diagnosed, treated, provided with medication, and at the end, when Mikkelsen anticipated a bill, there was no bill. The doctor declined, indicating that he knew what was happening. He knew that Elsa's child was a hidden Jewish child. He would not accept payment. I've thought about that doctor many times during the many years since that act of kindness. Eventually, the war was over. The soldiers went home. I actually remember seeing them in a long line, discarding the elements of war. and there was jubilation in the streets of Copenhagen. Life began to return to something normal. It was a time to be reunited with my mom. Now, I doubt if I was told what was about to happen. I was now 7 years old and a devoted farmer with 2 horses, 4 cows, a bunch of pigs. Why would I want to live in a city with this strange person that I didn't recognize and no animals? Nevertheless, this is what happened. I was suddenly in a room with this person called Mom. I was not the only one who was perplexed. My mother didn't recognize me. A lot happens to a kid from ages 4 to 7. So my mother grabbed my left hand, and especially my thumb, to see if there was a freckle there that she had recognized. And it's almost gone now, but I can still see a little bit. So a positive identification was made, and I was now reunited with my mother. 2 years later, I was bound for New York City aboard a boat, and then a Greyhound bus to California. Alas, I was no longer a little farmer. Part 3. What is it that we need to remember, and why? Well, the why is the easiest part. As the Spanish-American philosopher George Santayana insisted, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. But remembering is hard, particularly if what we are trying to remember is horrible. We tend to forget the horrible, don't we? Which may explain why we often forget. And we don't always remember the right things. Most think that we commemorate the Holocaust because of the 6 million human beings whose lives were cut short, because someone who thought himself infallible determined that they were lesser beings and should not be allowed to clutter the earth and interfere with his plans for a master race. Yes, I think that commemoration is of critical importance, but there's more to that than just remembering the deaths. There's the remembering of, or maybe the questioning of, how is it that we got to that place? How is it that we could imagine justifying the termination of so many lives? I had a conversation with Else a few years ago, and I recounted my experience of going to the Museum of Danish Resistance. There's this wonderful museum in Copenhagen that has been renovated since that particular visit. It tries to replicate and therefore explain the occupation as it was. Among the exhibits was a framed photograph of a woman hanging by the neck from a tree. Her crime had been that she sheltered a Jewish child. I knew that Else had also visited the museum, so I asked her if she had seen the photo. She had, but quickly added that she had never really given the risks involved much thought. She paused a minute and then said, "I did it because it was the right thing to do. That doctor who treated me, refusing to accept payment for his services, did the same. It's the right thing to do. He could have turned me in. Anybody in the community could have turned me in. The great secret about me was shared among members of this tiny farming community. No one turned me in." Else and the doctor and virtually everyone in the community who knew of my circumstances They all had this moral courage to do the right thing. There are times in our lives when we are called upon to step up, to do the right thing despite the risks. So why is that? What is the enabling force that allows us to do that? I really don't know. I mean, it's a terrible thing to get to this part of the sermon and say, I don't know. But that's a fact. I do have a speculation that I'll share. I think it's instinctive. It's an instinctive response to early learning about values. And our families do that work. Now, for some reason, there's a counter instinct having to do with self-preservation, or maybe it's self-benefit, or some other self-referent instinct that overpowers this initial instinct to do the right thing. For Elsa, there was no inner struggle. She knew what she had to do, and it never dawned on her to do otherwise. There have been times when I've wondered silently if what I've managed to do with my life has been worth the risk. This reflection sets aside any notion of self-importance or self-reliance. This idea of the self-made man is nonsense. We truly do need each other, and I shall always be grateful to my other mom for her courage in doing what she thought was the right thing. May it be so. Here's Elsa. She's 104. I visited her in October. We had lunch together. During lunch, she said, "Skal vi ikke have en lille en? Shouldn't we have a little one? A little snaps?" I said, "Yes, I think we should." And then she said, "Skal vi ikke have en til? Shouldn't we have one more?" Most adults can do two. She asked for 3.